Good afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about the independent panel which I chaired from the start of the year, and I'll go into some of the recommendations in the time that's available. But maybe to begin by giving you just a little bit of the background to the panel itself. The programme for government of the Fine Gael Labour Coalition, published in 2011, contained a number of specific commitments focused on strengthening accountability and performance in the civil service. And these issues were explored in a consultation paper which was published by Minister Brendan Howlin last January. The consultation paper contained a lot of ideas, some developed, others less so. And I suppose to put some sense on those ideas and to prepare a coherent plan, the government established an independent panel which I was invited to chair. And I was fortunate in this role in working with two other panel members, Dorothea Dowling and Michael Howard, whose contributions I should note today. We first met as a panel in the middle of January, and our work involved receiving submissions from a public consultation process. We also held about 60 meetings on an informal and formal basis with a range of interested groups and individuals. And this work, along with the review of the relevant literature in this space, assisted in informing our recommendations on strengthening accountability and performance in the civil service. In particular, I have to say, at a senior level in the administrative system. I think as a panel, Dorothea, Michael and myself had a significant advantage in the task that we were asked to undertake. None of us essentially had any skin in the game. Unlike members of previous reform groups, none of us had career paths which might be directly impacted upon by any of the changes we were likely to propose. And I suppose none of us were also in the space of touting for business from government departments. And I think in a sense that outsider perspective, if I can put it as that, was important as we reviewed and examined the relevant issues ahead of submitting our report, which we did at the end of May last. In building stronger accountability and performance arrangements, lessons can certainly be learned from previous initiatives, particularly to determine what proposals were successful and also what initiatives failed to match expectations. And in arriving at our recommendations, we considered a number of lessons from previous initiatives. In particular, the changes proposed must be integrated and joined up. Reforms must be properly resourced if they're to be successful. And that reforms must have clear ownership at both a political and administrative level, and that reforms need to be led by both. The ownership issue is important. We were intent on recommending a system at a senior level where issues would not fall between the cracks. We talk about the civil service as a single organisation, whereas in fact it's a series of organisations. And therein lies certain difficulties and some of the issues and challenges and controversies that it has faced. And our recommendations in particular for a new Civil Service Accountability Board and the appointment for the first time of a formal head of the civil service were aimed in particular at addressing that issue of ownership. Throughout the meetings with various stakeholders, if I can use that phrase, and the submissions that we reviewed as part of the consultation process, we were assisted in identifying a number of improvements to enable the development of a stronger civil service. In particular, what we heard included, and these are important issues, the need to bring greater clarity to the ministerial senior civil service relationship, while recognising the complexity involved. The need to address the demand from the public and from the political system to know who does what and to whom they are answerable within the system. The need to improve the capacity and capability of the system to deal with non-performance and underperformance, and distinguishing between the two. The need to empower the civil service to ensure that accountability is accompanied by appropriate autonomy and resources, that people have the resources to do the jobs they've been asked to do. The need to support the senior civil service in terms of strengthening performance and building leadership capacity, bringing more balance and more evidence-based approach, I suppose, to the discussions of civil service performance. The need to protect the long-term public interest and the need to build on the existing strengths in the system. And that latter point is also important, building on existing strengths. I have to say, I think one of the things that I learned over the 5-month period when we were doing our work as an independent panel, that there is a mini-industry in debating the ills of the Irish civil service. And indeed, I think it's fair to say it's kept several summer schools, including this one, busy for several years now. There is a lot, however, that is right with the civil service. And in that sense, I draw on my own professional experience over the last 2 decades. And that experience has included employment in the privately owned companies, being self-employed, and more latterly as a university professor. And I can testify, I think, to some of the shallowness around the debate, private sector good, public sector bad. And I think we need to move beyond that simple divide. Nevertheless, that should not take from the fact that the events since 2008 have quite correctly raised legitimate questions about civil service performance and the appropriateness of existing accountability arrangements. We're now emerging from the economic crisis, but the instability in the national finances and the effective collapse of our banking system has generated legitimate focus on whether the civil service was sufficiently independently minded during a crucial period in our recent history. So that's a little bit of the context to how we framed our recommendations. And now I'll touch on a couple of them. We've proposed to Minister Howlin and to the Government the establishment and the appointment of an accountability board for the civil service. So for the first time, there would be a high-level accountability mechanism with external membership to hold departments to account for their performance and delivery. In a sense, the civil service would have at its organisational peak a board of directors. The rationale for this recommendation is to introduce greater rigour to civil service accountability and performance. And we argue that having external oversight would offer a greater degree of public assurance. The board would have the advantage of providing an additional outward-looking focus for the civil service. And in particular, in recommending external membership, my colleagues and I on the independent panel believe that this would bring professional experience from diverse environments and different backgrounds into civil service performance and accountability management arrangements. The board would have a very fixed focus with a limited range of issues. It would be there to oversee the implementation of agreed cross-cutting policy priorities. It would be there to oversee the capacity and capability of the civil service, and it would be there to ensure that a new performance management arrangement, which we're also proposing, a new performance management arrangement for Secretaries General, was organised and implemented correctly. The board would be balanced in its membership between ministerial, civil service and external representation. We're quite explicit in the report about the type of person that we believe should serve on this board, the external members. They're there to ask questions, to challenge the civil service, and in that regard we've explicitly said that there should be experienced individuals, exceptionally experienced individuals, who've led and managed large, complex organisations. They should have an understanding of the challenges involved in civil service management, and they should have had successful prior careers. We're saying that at least one of those individuals, one of the 4, should come from outside the state, and that one of them should also come from public sector or a non-profit sector, and possibly somebody who may have held a role comparable to a head of the civil service in another jurisdiction. In reaching our recommendation in relation to the board, we studied the role of similar departmental or governance boards in the United Kingdom, Australia and Canada, and we see serious merit in the board and its role. On a personal level, and this is sort of stepping aside from the content of the independent panel's report, I would hope that once the overall board for the civil service has proven its value, consideration would be given to mandating all government departments to have individual boards with directors drawn from outside the civil service. I think that has proven to be successful in other jurisdictions, and I think it is a measure that we should look to here. But in the first instance, our recommendation is get it right for the civil service itself and then move on. Alongside the board, we also recommend the appointment of a head of the civil service. There are over 36,000 people working in the civil service. It represents 12% of public sector employment. It's hard to imagine a similarly sized and a similarly complex organisation without a designated head, without a designated chief executive. But that is how it is in the civil service in Ireland, and that's how it has evolved since 1922 without a formal head. Indeed, the centre has never really been formally defined. It's generally seen as encompassing the Department of the Taoiseach, the Department of Finance, and more recently the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And from our analysis of the situation elsewhere and discussions during our consultation process, we were strongly convinced of the merit in having a dedicated formal head of the Irish civil service. We believe that the challenges faced by the civil service require a formal corporate centre, and that having a full-time head of the civil service would lead to faster and more responsive policy delivery across the organisation. So, with the Accountability Board and head of the civil service, that ownership issue, which I mentioned previously, would be directly addressed. To be effective, the head of the civil service should have a limited but highly focused and ambitious remit, and that would include representing leadership and values, having responsibility for performance management, not just at a senior level but throughout the organisation, the civil service, having oversight of policy priorities, that departments have strategy statements, they say they're going to do X, Y and Z. Have they done X, Y and Z? Have they done it on time? And if not, why not? But there is actually now somebody asking those questions. There's an entity asking those questions and holding people to account. If I can touch on just maybe one or two of the responsibilities that we have recommended a head of the civil service would have. In particular, the issue of performance. The difficulty in managing underperformance and non-performance in the civil service was raised regularly in submissions and in our meetings. And while the numbers directly involved are limited, the problem is wider than the individuals concerned, as it adversely affects on the morale of all staff and those who are performing well. And it poses challenges for delivery and implementation of objectives, and as such impacts negatively on effective accountability and performance. At a senior level, we've recommended that the head of the civil service would design and introduce a performance management system for Secretaries General. This is not in place at the moment. We've recommended that this would be submitted to approval to the Accountability Board, which would oversee its implementation. In our report to Minister Howland, we've recommended that this is introduced in early 2015. This performance management system would examine both delivery within departments and contributions to a whole-of-government agenda. And the performance management system from the top then should cascade down through the system. As I say, we've also looked at the issue of strategy statements. This is mandated of all government departments under the 1997 legislation. They're required to produce 3-year strategy statements and annual reports. And we've recommended far greater engagement with these documents, which set out the targets and objectives of departments. And we've put in place a series of proposals which would transform the process for preparing and reviewing strategy statements to place them at the centre of the accountability regime. And in particular, we've looked at the issue of parliamentary oversight of those strategy statements. The Oireachtas obviously plays a crucial role in strengthening accountability and performance, and the appearance of senior civil servants and other officials at Oireachtas committee hearings and their engagement with members can enhance discussions about the implementation of policy and the objectives in the programme for government and in strategy statements. And we were conscious that as an independent panel, parliamentary reform was not, we had a lot on our plate, and we didn't want to bring parliamentary reform onto what was already a busy agenda. However, during the stakeholder meetings, there was repeated questioning about the effectiveness of the role of the Oireachtas in a meaningful accountability regime. And if I could summarise these observations, the quality and depth of discussion at Oireachtas committees is obviously important. It needs to reflect the seriousness of parliamentary oversight. And what we've said is, to be effective, these meetings should be marked by rigorous, meaningful and balanced engagement. And it's particularly important that there's a stronger research focus at Oireachtas committees to ensure that rather than dealing with the latest controversy or what has been in the papers in the last number of days, that there's a more evidence-based interaction with officials on complex policy issues, and that the Parliament and the Oireachtas committees have a significant role. One of our recommendations in this regard is that the head of the civil service reports annually and with an annual report to the relevant Oireachtas Committee, and is accompanied by one of the external members of the Accountability Board. And we make a number of other proposals in the area of Oireachtas committees. If I could touch on just one other area where we have recommendations in the report, and it's the issue of special advisers. And that's a theme that emerged in discussions between the independent panel and stakeholders. That theme was the need for greater clarity about the role of special advisers, as well as the accountability regime that should apply to the holders of those positions. Special advisers provide political, policy and communication supports to ministers, to whom they're directly accountable. And they work to ensure the implementation of the minister's agenda, as set down in the programme for government. And they bring an important political dimension to the advice provided to ministers. And that's advice that would not be appropriate to expect or demand from an impartial civil service. It's widely accepted, I think, now that special advisers have an important role to play in the administrative system. However, the interaction of special advisers and permanent civil servants can sometimes raise challenges. A situation not unique to Ireland, as similar issues arise in other jurisdictions. So what we've proposed is that special advisers in Ireland are not subject to a code of conduct, unlike ministerial staff in other countries such as the United Kingdom and Australia. They are subject to ethics legislation, freedom of information, Official Secrets Act and so forth. But there isn't a code of conduct, and we believe that the introduction of an accountability code would be beneficial in clarifying the role of the special advisor in the administrative system. And such a code would set out their responsibilities, their role and their relationship with civil servants, and the standards of conduct expected in the performance of their duties. We've also recommended the current situation where there is no formal induction training for those who take on these positions. Individual departments provide ad hoc briefings, but there's no system-wide training. So we've recommended formal induction training, and that it is mandatory for all new special advisers to enhance their understanding of the administrative system and how it interacts with the political system. If I could just briefly, before moving to conclude, just touch on the issue of numbers. And again, this is moving away from the independent panel report itself and speaking in a personal capacity. I think it's worth noting that the number of special advisers in Ireland is comparatively few when set against those employed in other Westminster systems, including Canada, New Zealand and Australia. And there are also significantly more political staff employed in cabinet systems like in France or in the EU. And they provide a very important policy, political and communication backup and support to ministers. Now, while not recommending or suggesting an increase in the overall number of advisers, I am minded to endorse a recent proposal in the United Kingdom that the number of ministerial advisers should be dependent upon cabinet rank and portfolio. So in that regard, senior ministers would require greater levels of support. And it is, I think, a legitimate question to pose that, is it fair and is it right that the Minister for Finance, under the rules that are in place, two per minister, that the Minister for Finance or the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform has the same number of advisers available to a line minister in a line department who may have less onerous or responsibilities. And I think that is something that needs to be worked on and looked at, particularly given that the current rules really were introduced to grab headlines around the formation of the current government. I think it may be worth having a look at whether the number of ministerial advisers should be changed and whether more senior ministers should have more advisers available to them. I've touched upon some but not all of the recommendations of the independent panel this afternoon. It's my strong view, and I know this is the view shared by my two colleagues, Dorothea Dowling and Michael Howard, that our recommendations should be implemented as an integrated and coherent programme of measures. We believe that piecemeal implementation would weaken their overall effectiveness. We obviously await the formal response of Minister Howlin and the Government. It's my understanding that that may actually come in September. And the fact that our report was published within 2 weeks of its submission at the end of May, which I think must be some sort of a record. But I think that obviously augurs well for some of the, if not all, of the recommendations that we have made. I believe that the implementation of our recommendations would have a substantial impact on the machinery of the administrative system and indeed of government, and that the new institutional structures would deliver what would be a very radical shake-up for the civil service, which in many ways has remained static in its organisational structure since 1922, and would produce a more cohesive civil service with absolute awareness among staff that they're part of a single institution with defined objectives. And those objectives include, first and foremost, delivering for the public. Okay, thank you very much.